Hello and welcome to AgriFocus, the podcast from Agriland that looks in depth at some of the topical issues of the day. I'm Stella Meehan and I'm joined today by Dr. Avril Hobson from the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, who is head of the National Disease Control Centre Surveillance and Imports Controls Policy Division. In recent weeks, it has become apparent that cases of bluetongue have significantly increased in parts of England and Wales, particularly the southwest of England around Devon and Cornwall. The data at the moment indicates that the animals most affected in these areas are sheep, cattle and even one llama. Naturally, livestock owners on this side of the Irish Sea are concerned about the potential spread of the disease from the UK, especially given that the cases so far detected in Ireland earlier this year supposedly resulted from infection possibly last autumn. So with the middle of autumn just around the corner, farmers here are wondering what might happen. Now, Dr. Avril Hobson, thank you for joining us. Firstly, take a step back for a moment, if you don't mind, and remind our listeners, because there are still some who might be unaware, what bluetongue is and what are the symptoms involved.
And thank you, Stella, for the opportunity to discuss bluetongue, which, like you've really outlined in your introduction, is potentially going to impact some of our flocks and herds in the months coming up. So bluetongue is a virus. It affects cattle and sheep. What's really important to understand about bluetongue is that it's spread with a midge, a culicoides midge. So it doesn't really spread from animal to animal. It can spread through semen and embryos, so it can't spread from breeding rams and bulls. But the most important way it's spread is through midges. It needs warm days for it to be spread, so the temperature has to be greater than 11 degrees for the virus to spread. So that's why it really has become important now during these times when we have this warm weather, that it's more likely that we're entering into the bluetongue season, whereas in winter and in the colder months there isn't so much of an issue because there isn't spread the midges. It doesn't spread through the midges. It has been in Europe for a number of years and it has been spreading westwards. And as you've pointed out in your introduction, we found it first in Ireland in January, and our investigations suggest that the infection occurred in September of 2025, and we found it in antibodies, which shows that the animals were exposed, and these animals at the time didn't show any significant clinical signs.
That's very interesting, Dr. Hobson, isn't it? I mean, when we think of bluetongue, and we have seen some pictures of animals who have what looks like, I suppose, where it got its name, the BTV virus, the actual bluetongue, like a sort of a purpley dark hue of navy on the tongue of, a cow, for example. But that is obviously displaying bluetongue. But you're outlining to people that it's not just symptomatic bluetongue that can exist, where a farmer or a livestock owner can see the symptoms, that you could be asymptomatic.
Absolutely. So there's a full range of symptoms from no clinical signs, so you won't even be aware that it's in your herd or your flock, all the way through to mortality. And I guess what might be most interesting is if we go through the clinical signs that they're reporting in Great Britain, because that's more than likely what's ahead of us. So in sheep, they have reported swollen face and lips, lesions such as ulcers or erosions in their mouth, with drooling, lameness, and that's usually because the coronary band, so that's the band between the hoof and the legs, are swollen. Lethargy, so just animals that are lying around just looking despondent, just not inactive. Fever, so animals exhibiting temperatures, and then, as I've said, mortality, so animals dying. Then in cattle, quite less symptomatic in some ways. So you can have crusting of the muzzle, so the area around the face, around their teats, lesions in their mouth, lameness, and then stiff limbs, so they're just reluctant to move, and then temperature as well. But in GB currently, sheep seem to be the most severely affected species, and that representing 95% of the latest reported cases.
Really interesting, actually, that it's the sheep and flocks that are being affected there in the southwest. I mean, look at obviously the symptoms that you said there are not good. They indicate unwell animals, be it sheep or cattle. But I know when we were speaking to your colleague as well from the Department of Agriculture earlier this year, and indeed at the back end of last year in relation to bluetongue, and another issue that, definitely surveillance vets and experts are looking at is, for example, if cattle, abort a calf and what might have caused that.
Absolutely. So that at the beginning of the year, that was a big concern and a big what would have been messaged and communicated was the sort of infertility aspect. So it can cause bluetongue, and it depends when the animals are infected. So if the animals are infected when they just go in calf or they just go in lamb, they usually reabsorb the fetuses or the embryos, so they might just return to service. So you may not see anything apart from more animals not holding service. If they get infected sort of mid-pregnancy or mid-gestation, so that might be sort of 4 to 5 months in cattle or 2 to 3 months in sheep, then they can abort, so you'll actually see the abortion, or they can maintain the pregnancy, but you get deformed calves, deformed lambs, often with hydranencephaly, which means their brains aren't properly formed. So the calf or lamb may be born dead, but they may be born alive and then die shortly afterwards, or some of them can live, but they're referred to as dummy calves in that, they might stay standing or they might stay lying down. They don't have their normal activity, and usually it isn't consistent with life, so they often have to be euthanized, for their welfare after, a week. So they can be kept alive, but it's not conducive with normal life. And that has been, and we also, which I hadn't mentioned, is in dairy cows, you can see milk drop. So you can get a reduced milk production. So there's a huge, and if you're dairy herd, and that was one of the aspects of farming in Ireland, that we have quite compact calving patterns, that if you are unlucky and you get an incursion of bluetongue into your herd at the wrong time, it might mean that you have quite a significantly high percentage of your animals either returning to service, having abortions, or having calves that are either dead at birth or die shortly after birth.
And it's my understanding as well that even when cows are being impregnated, that the disease can be transferred through semen as well. I think that's what I read on
Absolutely.
in terms of
Yeah, so we have quite tight controls over our AI stations and semen controls. So that has been identified for a long time in EU regulations and the animal health law, which is sort of the umbrella EU regulation for animal diseases. Semen can be significant in spreading a wide range of diseases. So bulls that are in AI stations are tested regularly for bluetongue and a range of other diseases. So the risk of it coming through semen that is bought through an approved AI centres, which all our AI centres are, or imported semen, is quite low. However, if you have a bull that is not vaccinated and gets infected, or a ram that gets infected and is running with your ewes, then it's quite likely that they would be significant, in spreading the disease.
Yeah, it's definitely worth bearing in mind as well. And let's talk about the vaccination then. So, with the cases which are quite prolific now in the southwest of England, for example, at the moment, is there any data as such yet on whether those animals, flocks, herds, whatever they might be, who tested positive, the animals that tested positive for the BTV3 virus, were they vaccinated, or do we have any data on that?
So, anecdotally, and speaking to colleagues in GB and in DEFRA, it would appear that the vaccination uptake has been quite low in GB, and a lot of these animals were not vaccinated. The vaccines have been shown to be really effective. They don't stop the animals getting the disease, but they reduce the clinical signs, and they reduce the symptoms of it. So vaccines have been shown to be very effective. I think, GB have had bluetongue for a number of years. It came into the southeast of England. It started in sort of the Kent area, and it was quite confined in that part of GB, and then it moved westward. So, and didn't show a lot of clinical signs. And I think, everybody was wondering, because in the Netherlands, and Belgium and Germany and other EU countries, they had reported significant clinical signs similar to what's happening in GB now. And then when it arrived in GB, the animals weren't exhibiting clinical signs, and there was a lot of questions why that might have been. But now, it's obviously now definitely shown what bluetongue can truly be by these real difficulties that farmers are facing over there. So, I think if you look at the distribution of farm animals in Great Britain, definitely in Devon, Cornwall, Wales, there's a much higher concentration of cattle and sheep in those areas. So that may have something to do with it, or it could be just there's more virus around. It's the midges have a midge population are being more effective at spreading, but it definitely has taken off in southwest of England at the moment, and Wales.
In terms of the vaccination then in Ireland, and Agriland has reported on I suppose, the advice regarding vaccination and various figures on uptake. I don't know if this can be backed up with data, but anecdotally here as well, I feel like our livestock owners would be more, I suppose, in favour of getting the vaccine and more interested in wondering what the vaccine might do for them to protect their own livestock.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we did a lot of engagement, and I want to give credit to all the stakeholders, all the farming stakeholders, from the farming organisations, the milk processors, the meat processors, Chagas, Animal Health Ireland. There was this Veterinary Ireland. There was a significant interest in bluetongue when it arrived. There was a lot of webinars hosted by a lot of different organisations where, farmers were given the information and about bluetongue and about the options available. So there was an interest, and I think when, because of our calving pattern that I mentioned already, and the potential impact on milk supply, and then also amongst our sheep farmers, there was a significant interest in vaccinations and uptake of vaccinations. And then that was helped, vaccinations for bluetongue has been included in our beef welfare and our sheep welfare schemes, so that obviously helped as well. So that, yeah, there has been good uptake, and I know there's been reports of shortage of vaccines in GB, but from our information, there doesn't appear to be any shortage of supply in Ireland, and I think that's because of the healthy uptake earlier in the year. It is a commercial decision for companies, where they place their vaccines, but we have no information that there's any issues with supply. And I suppose I take this opportunity that farmers that haven't had taken the opportunity to vaccinate at this stage for whatever reason, they really should look at what's happening in GB and reconsider. It takes 3 weeks for ewes and sheep to be fully immunised for bluetongue after a single vaccine, and then cattle take 2 vaccination shots, and it takes 6 weeks for cattle to become fully immunised. So even if you haven't done it now, it's still worthwhile doing, because if the symptoms that are happening in GB arrive, we start seeing that, unfortunately, at that stage, it's too late to vaccinate, because, that's a lag time from the time of injection to from the time the animals are fully immunised.
That's a good point, that if it arrives here and we start to see the level of cases that they are reporting now in Wales and Devon, Cornwall and so on, as you said, at that point we're probably a bit too late. So we have this window of opportunity, because I know your colleague Dr. Owen Ryan would have said previously in the year, around April was a good time to talk to your own personal vet about vaccinating your flocks or your herds, because we were coming into the milder temperatures. But just because that was the advice in April doesn't mean that you still can't do it now. If you spoke to your vet this week, you could get the vaccine, and by that sort of peak autumn time, end of September, then you could have done the best you possibly can for your livestock herd or flock.
Absolutely. And, this is a time when sheep farmers are going to be, there's a lot of activity with the ewes. They're drafting ewes, sorting them out, deciding which ones they're keeping for breeding. So, ewes and rams, because, there would be a concern that maybe sheep, we didn't focus on sheep. There was a lot of communications around milk drop, infertility in cows, but, we shouldn't overlook our sheep flocks. So, yeah, absolutely. If at the beginning of the year we would have said, yeah, the best time was do it like, late spring around that time you mentioned. But absolutely, if you haven't vaccinated, it definitely is worth considering, and speak to your own private veterinary practitioner or, other farmers that have vaccinated, and strongly consider vaccinating because, it is causing mortality. Anecdotally, I spoke to a colleague in England, and they said that yo deaths have increased by a factor of 8 in some parts of England. So, there isn't. That was just a sense, so that's anecdotal. But if that is true, that's a significant number of ewes to be dying over there.
Absolutely. That's the biggest point, is the impact that it could have on the livestock flocks and herds in this country. And as with anything, even when you're talking about human health, when they brought in the chickenpox vaccine for small children a number of years ago in Ireland, it took a little while for that filter into the culture of young parents having their children and getting into the chickenpox vaccine. And now that's very popular, and almost, all children, or the majority certainly, are getting that now. So it takes a little while to build in that sort of a familiarity with getting this kind of vaccine. But the alternative, Dr. Hobson, what is the alternative, in the sense of what would be the impact in this country on the ag sector if we were to get the levels of bluetongue that they're currently experiencing in the southwest of England and Wales? What if we were to get that, if it came across the Irish Sea to the southeast, or Munster, particularly very big livestock areas here? What would happen if we got such prevalence of the virus?
I think the impact would be devastating. We can see the difficulty farmers are having at the moment with the prolonged drought we've had, grass growth, the impact on production. So, you know, you could look at the production model. So is that like milk production, even beef animals, sheep, lambs, with these sort of symptoms, they're not going to gain weight. So you're going to have, production losses. But then worse, it's the obviously mortality at its outside. And I saw some posts that farmers in Devon and places like that have put up, and they're just devastated because one lady I saw, she didn't want to go out to look at her flock because every time she went out there was dead sheep in the field. So the trauma, obviously from an animal perspective, that's awful, but like even the trauma and stress that would bring on, like, things can be difficult enough without having something that befall you. And the vaccine is very effective. So, it would be devastating, but, we are hopeful. And because of the uptake of vaccines that, we would hope, but saying that, it's not 100% uptake of vaccines. So we know there are herds and flocks that, for whatever reason, may not have considered or hadn't time, or just didn't think it was important enough to vaccinate, or for whatever reason. There's multiple reasons why people mightn't vaccinate. So that's why we can't stress enough, really, to talk to your vet, or your other farmers, neighbours, whoever, about vaccinating, because it really is the only effective risk mitigation method out there to protect your animals from the impact of bluetongue.
And then when you look at what's being monitored at the moment, and I also spoke to, colleagues of DAFM north of the border in Athby, and they have a lot of scientists there who monitor midge, for example, or fly migration across the Irish Sea. Our climate is changing. We're certainly getting more many more consistent days of that, that kind of base temperature of above 11, 12 degrees on a more consistent basis than we would have, years ago. So will it be a matter for the likes of those kind of scientists as well, that they will keep monitoring this situation, particularly over the next, we'll say, 3 months?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose there's two things that can be monitored. Um, so one is looking at midges and looking for Paris midges, so midges that are reproducing. So that would show that for some months, so during maybe from October to November, uh, midges stop reproducing, so they don't spread it. But the other thing is to look at the modelling of the wind pattern, and that's what we would have looked at to detect when, and that's why we suggested that last year it came in around the 28th, or just, well, the end of September. So, so we collaborate with Met Éireann, with Severa in the Vet College in UCD, and to look at this modelling. So, for example, in the last months, there was 2 days out of 33 where the wind has been blowing in the correct direction to facilitate incursion of midge plume from the affected areas. So, some days the wind goes east to west, north to south, but that I wouldn't take over comfort out of days out of 32, because once it's in the island, it doesn't matter what way the wind blows. So that's just, and we know that the midges can blow from England across the Irish Sea into Ireland, but once the midges and infected midges are established in Ireland, then all looking at wind patterns just tells you, well, they're blowing north today, they're blowing east, they're just blowing around, and they do blow on the wind. So I suppose that brings us back to, well, how can you effectively protect your animals when the midges spread it? They're spread by the wind, which none of us can control. So it's back to the importance of vaccinating your animals.
Absolutely. And finally, another thing that maybe might be able to help in the research, Dr. Hobson, would be perhaps some participation by the livestock owners, by the farmers, after, for example, maybe they have, abortion in animals, or cows that have stillborn calves and so on, that they can contribute to the research and the monitoring by providing those blood samples.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, thanks so much for raising that, Stella. That's a really, really important point. So we'd absolutely encourage farmers, if they have animals that abort, that they would get their vet out to submit bloods. It's paid for by the department. Any abortion, so the aborted fetuses like lambs or calves should be brought to the regional veterinary labs. And then, not only is that to diagnose bluetongue, but there are other diseases on the continent that are could have similar impact on our livestock and on our agri-food industry. So that whole piece, of notifying or investigating abnormal events, equally unexplained mortality or these clinical signs. And so we do get suspect cases. So if you go out and you see in your animals unusual signs, then report to the RVO, or report it to your vet in the first instance, or the regional veterinary office. We will go out and take samples and then send it to the laboratory, and then we not only test it for bluetongue but other diseases. And just a small mention of foot and mouth disease, which brings everybody back to the horrors of 2001. We've had foot and mouth, for years. It wasn't in Europe. We thought, it's gone. It's in countries far, far away. But in 2025, it was in Germany, Hungary, and Slovakia. This year, Cyprus and Greece are dealing with it. So, the risk of it coming into Ireland is still low. But a lot of these symptoms that we mentioned earlier, unfortunately, these are also symptoms of foot and mouth disease. So that's why it's really, really important for all our farmers and everyone to remember that if they're seeing these clinical signs, that they submit it to the lab, because the sooner we find any of these diseases, and hopefully we don't find it, but the sooner we find it, then the sooner we can deal with it, and then deal with it effectively to get back to normal. Bluetongue is slightly different because it's spread by midges. It's it is something that people are going to have to build in to their vaccination schedule, and that's again something probably that they should be, during the autumn to think about. Well, we vaccinated last spring, we had to do it at short notice. How can we build it into our vaccination program for next year? So, it's going to unfortunately become one of these annual vaccines along with the other vaccination diseases that people vaccinate against.
Yeah, Dr. Hobson, I think that is an important point for people to remember now, that it is, as I said earlier, nearly a culture of having that as part of your health plan for your herd or your flock going forward, because this won't be a flash in the pan. As I said, migrating patterns of various species are consistently changing climate and so on, that it is important. And as the old saying goes, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. You could take the risk and say, I'll be okay, but then you could end up in a lot of bother later this year. So it's definitely worth having a good relationship with your own personal vet, talking to them. And now is really an optimum time to get that vaccination ahead of the autumn potential migration of those midges from the southwest of England. So therefore, the advice would be to just go talk to the vet. And obviously the same as ourselves here in Agriland, we'll keep farmers in Ireland up to date as much as we can about the latest advice, and certainly signpost them to where they might be able to get more information and advice as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Stella. I think that's really, providing the information and, speaking to the vets, speaking to, groups, farmers, everybody, I think information is king, and that communication. But absolutely, I couldn't agree more with you.
Well, that's all we have time for on this episode of AgriFocus. Thanks to our guest today, Dr. Avril Hobson from the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, and also National Disease Control Centre. If you found this episode interesting, please rate and review it on the podcast platforms, and do indeed share it with someone who might like to listen, particularly those livestock owners, because there's a lot of good advice there from Dr. Hobson. But until next time from AgriFocus, goodbye and take care.